I'll be talking more about how the climate change is affecting the marine biodiversity. So let's move to the first slide. So the world is covered with approximately 70% water, and the amount of life in the ocean is enormous. Approximately 2.2 million species are reported in the ocean, according to a study conducted by Mora et al. In 2011. And approximately 1,500 new creatures in the world ocean is being reported almost every year. So we also know that almost 91% of the ocean species have yet to be classified, and 95% of the ocean is remain unexplored. So it is fairly easy to say that the number of species living in the ocean is unknown. However, there is a fear that many species, before being identified in the ocean or before being recognized by us, will go extinct, and mainly because of the climate change. More often these days, we hear the news about the marine biodiversity under the climate change conditions with a catchy title in the news, such as warming is altering the life abundance, new species are migrating to the colder waters. Example, recently there was a report that the hammerhead shark is soon to be spotted in the water in the UK because of the sea water level, sea temperature rise. Further, it is also common these days to hear the news about the penguins are wiped out due to the climate change, or the turtles are losing their nesting sites because of the seawater rise, and the corals, which are mostly bleached due to the deoxygenation or due to the ocean acidification conditions, and not only the macroorganism, even the microorganisms, for example, the phytoplanktons, are fairly changing or affecting due to the climate change conditions. Now, in the recent time, it has been also seen that a number of harmful algal blooms are happening across the world ocean. More recently, I am sure that many of us are aware that there was a Noctulica bloom in our Tamil Nadu coastline, where we experienced more or less 1 month of gloomy situation along the coastline. So this also can be fairly well to say that because of the climatic change conditions. And we are also seeing that a number of diseases are popping up in the different species, different marine organisms, because of the increase in temperature and acidified waters. So these striking examples compel us to believe that climate change is happening and marine organisms are suffering from this. In the present talk, in the today's presentation, I would bring several facts, figures, consequences of climate change, which is happening in the present ocean. So my talk will be mostly divided into several bullet points. First is that what is climate change? A brief history of the climate change. What are the consequences of the climate change on the marine environment? Mostly I'll be focusing on ocean warming and ocean acidification, even though I would say now itself that there are several other consequences in the marine environment. For example, there is a fluctuation in the salinity, there is extreme events, and like deoxygenation and so on. But mostly I'll be focusing on ocean warming and ocean acidification. And then in the latter part, we will see that what could be the potential mitigation and the adaptive approaches we can take to curb the climate change, and what should be our responsibility in order to minimize the effect of climate change on the marine organisms. So to begin with, the question is, what is climate? We can fairly well say that climate is the average of weather over time and space. So any change in the environment which is happening in a very short term, that we can say as weather. But if that includes a pattern, it's a pattern of precipitation, or humidity or wind or season, then we can say it's a climate. Now, why do we worry about the climate change? Because mostly it's happening at a reasonably rapid scale. Natural fluctuation has happened in the past, is happening in the present, and will happen in the future. But the most important concern is the speed at which it is happening. In the graph here, let me see the spotlight. Okay, so in this graph, you can see that more or less 1 degree temperature has been increased in last 25 to 30 years, right? What are the reasons of this increase in the temperature? Well, we all are aware that greenhouse gas is the major reason for the climate change, and in particular carbon dioxide, which comprises of almost close to 70% of the total greenhouse gases. And yeah, we can say that carbon dioxide atmospheric, which is originated from the anthropogenic activities, is one of the major reasons of the global warming on the planet Earth. Now, we often hear that climate is changing rapidly, and most of the instances we see that it is happening since the Industrial Revolution. Based on BBC News on Science and Environment, and there is a fantastic book on entitled The Discovery of Global Warming, I have plotted a few timeline in the history of climate change. We can start with the beginning of Industrial Revolution in 1712, when the steam engine was discovered or invented. Since then, in 1824, first time the greenhouse effect was described, and in the another 3 decades, the heat trapping properties of carbon dioxide was discovered. Now, soon after that, there were many studies, or there were studies which showed that other than carbon dioxide, gases like water vapor, nitrous oxide, and so on, are also creating greenhouse effect. One of the landmark discovery in the 18th century was the discovery of, or the invention of, the motor wagon by Carl Benz. And since then, the automobile industry is creating a large chunk of carbon dioxide, which is causing global warming. Now, in the graph here, we can see that the carbon dioxide is increasing rapidly. However, in the past, in the geological era, most of the carbon dioxide or most of the heating events is based on the techniques which was very indirect, not directly temperature measurement or carbon dioxide measurement. But in 1958, Charles David Kelling started measuring the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And soon after that, in 1965, first warning of carbon dioxide as a real concern was worldwide known. In 1988, IPCC was formed, that is a panel, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is taking care of the curbing the climate change effects on the various ecosystem, on the human across the planet. So that panel is giving its report since 1990 and telling us what all the measures are taken to curb the climate change. Now, I would like to focus more on this particular graph, if everybody can see. For a large portion of 1000 year, last 1000 year, you can see that there is there is a very little fluctuation in the temperature. However, in the last 20 to 25 years of the last decade, of the last century, that is 2000, you will see that there is a sudden increase in the graph, the red peak here. This is called as hockey stick graph, and it was published in 1998, which has actually changed the way we see the climate change is happening, and it is a very nice representation of how fast the changes are happening. As I said, that the global temperature in the past was also high, there were cycles of warmer and colder temperature, which is more or less similar to the cycle of temperature and precipitation within our human time scales. And as I said in the past, that there were indirect measures which was used to measure what is the temperature in which geological time scale. And only from 1900s, it was clear that the temperature is increasing. There was a famous scientist called as Calendar, who took the observation, or who summed the observation which was accumulated from millions of data across the world and plotted in a very meaningful graph, which said that the temperature is increased almost 0.5 degrees Celsius between 1890 to 1953. And he also suggested that this rise could be linked to the atmospheric carbon dioxide emission. Right? Now, we have seen that the climate change is happening, right? And we have seen that it is happening mostly because of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide. There are several impacts associated with it, or there are several consequences associated with it. In this graph, or in this very nice picture, you can see that different temperature, rise in the different temperature, either if it is 0.8 degree from now, or 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree, 5 degree, 6 degree, will lead to various consequences, right? Some of the most effective, or most effective, or you can say the consequence, is the heat waves, ocean warming, ice melting, sea level rise, and several other consequences. However, we are not going to focus on those things, because in the present talk, we are more focused on consequences in the ocean. Now, in this nice poster by Monterey Bay Aquarium, you can see that the elevation in carbon dioxide will lead to two things. One is that increase in the global temperature, ultimately increasing the temperature in the sea, causing the ocean warming, and adding more carbon dioxide into the sea, causing to acidification, and that is ocean acidification. We will see independently what is ocean warming and ocean acidification in the coming slides. However, before that, we will see one of the consequences. Again, in this graph, in this poster, if you see, there are several consequences like sea level rise, bleaching, emergence of toxic algae, habitat destruction, ocean acidification, and then the disruption in the fisheries, which can affect the marine food web. Now, before to go in detail about the ocean acidification and ocean warming, I'd like to focus more on what is sea level rise. In the sea level rise, you can see that 3 millimeter of sea water is increasing every year. And that is happening in the graph, which you can see the sea height variation. In the last 20 years, 3 mm per year on an average sea has increased. One of the major reasons for the sea level rise is the thermal expansion of the seawater. It means the seawater has the tendency to expand upon heating. It means it requires more space to fill. And the second reason is the glacier melting, or you can say the ice cap melting in the polar region, right? Now, there are several consequences of the sea level rise. One of the most striking example is this one, where you can see that the sea level, because of the sea level rise, the island in the Hawaii, one of the Hawaii island is almost submerged into the sea after a hurricane attack, due to the hurricane. Now, there are also examples where the coastal, just a moment, it's declining. Yeah. So there are instances where you can see that the coast is filled up with the seawater because of the sea level rise. In one of the example in the lower right, I don't know who is requesting for the screen sharing.
What happened?
Somebody is requesting the screen sharing, so that's really strange. So I'll decline it anyway. To continue this,
Yes, yes.
to continue this. Oh, it's continuous. Anyway, to move further, in the lower right, you can see one person. He is a friend of mine from my PhD, old days PhD in Italy. You can see that the sea level is coming up on the roads in the Ischia port in Italy, and this is one of the way where we used to go our research lab. So you can see it's a frequently sea water is coming on the road and interrupting the day-to-day life for us, and let's say the rise in the sea level, right? Now, sea level rise, many of us will think that we are not going to affect it because of the sea level rise, because we generally can't or we generally don't foresee the effects what is happening. Here is one of the example which was published in National Geographic magazine in July 2019 in Sundarbans. As we all know that the Sundarban is one of the largest mangrove ecosystem in the world. Now in the figure, in the images, you can see that there is an intrusion of the sea level rise, sea water into the plains or into the islands, and most of the houses are submerged. Here in below in one of the images, you will see that the path of the home is actually connected using the bricks. And here in this image, you can see that the roads or the connectivity between the two houses are already interrupted because of the sea level rise. So it is happening, and happening even in our country. Only thing is that we have to look into the examples what is happening. Another striking example is the disappearing of the Van Island, which is putting the India's biodiversity at risk, and it is also hitting the local tourism. Now, in 1986, this Van Island, which is in the Gulf of Mannar, between India, not the island is shared, but Gulf of Mannar is shared between India and Sri Lanka. And it is one of the island in Tuticorin group of island, which is left only 2 hectares in 2014 from 16 hectares in 1986. So it is causing the biodiversity loss, and it is one of the striking example that the sea level rise is causing the loss of the Indian lands. There are several other examples even in the Lakshadweep archipelago, where 2 or 3 islands have been either at the verge of submergence or has already submerged in the past few years. So it is happening. Now we know that the sea level rise will definitely impact the terrestrial landscape which is going inside the sea. But we should not forget that it is also affecting the marine ecosystem. And how it is happening is, I will just show you some of the examples. Now in this image, you can see that this is a present day sea level, and then you have sea plants, mostly let's say seagrass or seaweed or mostly macrophytes. In the second image, if the sea level rise scenario is happening, or if the sea level is rising, then there are chances that the light will penetrate less, or there will be extreme currents or underwater currents which will make it difficult for the seaweed or seagrasses to grow in that depth. So they will be left with 2 options: either to stay there and adapt, or move towards the land. In case if it has the potential to move toward the land, it will occupy the it will move vertically up in towards the land, or otherwise it will stay there and either adapt or extinct. Now in one of the example down here in this figure, you can see that this is the today's scenario in the sea level rise, where you have a lot of corals, fishes, and so on. In the future, when the sea level rise will happen, some of the corals may able to occupy the upper continental shelf and some may not, which may not will ultimately go extinct. And we have to understand that if any habitat forming species are extinct, it is not that particular species which is extinct, but all the associated communities associated with that particular group of organism will also go extinct. The second example, I think I said in the past slide also, that it is because of the loss of the beaches, it is destroying the nesting area of the turtles. In 2011 and 12, when I was associated with ISA Kolkata, at that time we were doing frequent surveys for the turtle nestings in the West Bengal coast. Now, very often in the highest high tide time during the Purnima or Amavasya time, mostly those beaches were submerged with the water till the place where the road starts. So it means it was covering all the beach. So practically no place for turtles to come and nest. And we all know that the turtles are coming back to the same place where, to lay the eggs year and year after. So ultimately it is going to affect the population of turtles. Now, frequent high tides will also alter the benthic community in the intertidal area. One of the example which I would like to give is this paper which was recently published where the physical determinants of the intertidal communities on dissipative beaches were examined. And as we all know that the sediment or the physical characteristic of the sand particles determine the invertebrate community and the ecosystem functioning in the benthic environment. So if there are sea level rise, it is going to displace the beaches and it will cause the steeper beach with large particle size and practically promote the group of benthic invertebrate which can associate with the large particle size and kind of not support those organisms where the large particle size is not a suitable substrate to grow. In the paper, they have said, or it is said, that the larger particle size eliminate the large polychaete, such as nifty species. And we all know that polychaete, this particular polychaete plays a very important role functionally, causing or improving the functional biodiversity. And any elimination of this particular polychaete in the intertidal ecosystem can ultimately cause the loss of functional diversity and collapse the ecosystem. There are few other examples of the sea level rise and how it is impacting the biodiversity. There are French islands worldwide, mostly in the Pacific, where it was shown that the increase in the sea level rise is on an average decreasing 2 to 6% of the species in those islands. And that is not only because of the sea level rise. There are other associated damages which is happening along with the sea level rise, that is either due to the lateral erosion, due to the tidal, more frequent tides or current patterns and flooding of the coast, as well as also increased salinity in the shorelines. In this particular example, which is a very, very nice case study to understand that how the sea level will affect the biodiversity, is that you can see there are several species of sea grasses associated in this particular picture, which is associated or which is occupying different region of the continental shelf. Now, for example, in this Halophylla species, several Halophylla species are present in coastal intertidal, subtidal, deep water, reef subtidal, in all the regions of the continental shelf. Now, these minor or this simple structured seagrass have the higher plasticity, and as you increase in the complexity of seagrass, there is a decreasing the plasticity. So as a result of which, if the seagrasses will have to move toward land, mostly the simple seagrasses will be abundant in the land side area, and mostly the more complex seagrasses or having the more rhizome persistence may not be able to tolerate the high sea level rise. So again, as I said in the past, that every time we have to think in a way that if any seagrass or a structuring species are eliminated, not only that particular species are eliminated, but the associated communities to that species are also eliminated. Now, Halophylla is a very simple structured seagrass, may not be able to sustain that huge diversity what the Thalasia or Chimodochia could actually sustain. So ultimately, the whole thing can lead to a loss in the biodiversity. Now, this was the case with the sea level rise. We have seen that how the sea level rise can affect the biodiversity as a whole, through the example of turtle nesting, coral or seagrass presence in the coast and the continental shelf. Now coming back into more detail about ocean warming and ocean acidification. Before to go into how this ocean warming and acidification will impact the marine organism, I'd like to bring some of the basics of ocean warming and ocean acidification. As we all have seen that the global warming is happening, so if the global warming is happening, there is an increase in the temperature. Simultaneously, there is also an increase in the oceanic temperature, right? So as the global warming is happening, ocean warming is also happening. Now, we all are aware that how important this great ocean conveyor belt is. But this ocean conveyor belt can be easily disrupted because of the climate change. Any event which can disrupt the mixing of the colder water or to bring that colder water down or to bring the warmer water up, any such event can actually severely affect this great ocean conveyor belt. Now, this great ocean conveyor belt is responsible for major events on the earth, for example, El Nino and so on, will affect the climate further on the land, and it can change the precipitation pattern and so on. At the same time, this conveyor belt is also responsible for nutrient recycling, transport of the plankton, and any effect on the temperature on the conveyor belt will disrupt the functioning of the ecosystem worldwide. Now, briefly, we will look what the ocean acidification is. As we all know that the atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing. With the increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide, there is also increase in the dissolved carbon dioxide in the sea, because ocean act as a carbon storage for the atmospheric carbon, and almost 25 to 30% of the carbon dioxide which we are releasing into the atmosphere is ultimately going into the ocean. Once the carbon dioxide, when it goes into the ocean, it dissociates into water and carbonic acid. This is a reversible process where the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion are formed, and further this hydrogen ion will elevate the pH and cause ocean acidification. That is the cause ocean acidification. So overall, what is important to understand in this slide is that once the ocean acidification is happening, or once the carbon dioxide is dissolving into the seawater, the pH and the carbonate will decrease and the bicarbonate ion will increase. Now, we all know that carbonate is one of the essential element or essential thing for any calcifiers, because because it is important in the calcification process of the calcifiers. It's the cell. Any decrease in the carbonate will ultimately affect the calcifying organisms. So calcifying organisms have to undergo two different effects. One is decalcification of the cells. Second, because of the lowering of pH. And second, since the initial material, that is the carbonate, is less and less in the seawater, it is not getting enough starting material to build up the cell. So at the same time, the cell will disintegrate and the new cell cannot keep up with the pace of disintegration of the cell, right? However, important, anyway, we'll see in the next slide. So as I was saying in the last slide, that the carbon dioxide, if it is going inside the water, uh, it is reacting with water, forming the H plus ion, decreasing the pH and increasing the bicarbonate, decreasing the carbonate. So which is actually blocking all the calcifiers to build up the cell and affecting the whole marine ecosystem. This problem can lead to more difficult to build the calcium carbonate cell, less energy for growth and reproduction, smaller and weaker cell, as a result of which threatening the biodiversity, threatening the food security, threatening the fisheries, threatening the tourism, threatening the global economy, right? One thing is clear till now, that climate change is happening and climate change acts as a stressor for various marine organisms. And since it's a stressor, there are chances that it can affect the fitness of the individual or fitness of the organismal physiology, or let's say to survive and or to cope up with the climatic conditions. A very known cycle for the fitness to understand is that if any of the process in the life history of the organism is affected, the fitness will decrease. Let us start from here. If there is any problem, or if there is any fitness issue at the reproduction level, it will reduce the fitness, reproductive fitness, right? So it can affect the reproductive fitness, because most of the marine invertebrates are having the external fertilization. It depends on the surrounding environment. If the surrounding environment will have the lower pH condition, that may impact the sperm count or egg fertility of the species, and ultimately causing the damaging the reproductive performance of the organism. There are several examples for this. Similarly, elevated sperm fertilization so what is also happening is that because of the increase in the temperature or decrease in the pH, there are unselective sperm fertilization into the egg, and now that can cause the genetic incompatible sperm to be fertilized with the egg, and then maybe the zygote, maybe the quality of the zygote or the will not be able to sustain in the long run. Similarly, the juvenile or the larval survival in the crabs or other invertebrates are also seen to be affected. When it comes to adult male and female sexual selection, or when it comes to find the mate, the disruption in the communication between the mate due to the inability of pheromone detectability is affecting the sexual selection, or it is affecting the, or it is decreasing the fitness at this level. And also one important point to be noted is that the sex ratio in the fishes and the reptiles are very much temperature dependent. For example, in the turtles, if the temperature is higher, then more and more females will be produced than the male. So any changes in the sex ratio or any disruption in the communication between the mate can ultimately affect the fitness of the organism. Now, this is what I am talking about at the individual level or at the organismal level. Let us go a little bit big into to see the bigger picture of the process. If the environment, ocean acidification, warming, or hypoxia, one thing is very important to understand, that none of the environmental factor alone works. Since it's a natural ecosystem or it's a natural environment, all the stressors can work combinedly. So in this picture, you can see that ocean acidification, warming, or hypoxia, which is affecting the physiological processes, that is the acclimation ability of the organism, will get affected. that can affect the metabolic performance, ultimately ultimately decreasing the survival, growth, and reproduction of the individual. Now, individual combines forms the population. Any effect on the survival, growth, reproduction, or the physiological process, acclimation, or metabolic performance will affect the abundance and the distribution of the distribution or the productivity of the population. It can go back and affect again, like increase the acclimation or adaptation, or it will affect the species, the one step up in the biological hierarchy, at the biological interaction in the food web or the energy flow. Further, at the community level, by affecting the ecosystem function, resilience of the community, stability of the community, and productivity. How we all are related to this particular consequence is because it is also affecting at the society. It means that if there is a consequence of the climate change on the marine ecosystem, it will actually affect the fisheries productivity and the other ecosystem services it is providing for our benefit or for the societal benefit, right? In this figure, you can see that in the coral reefs in New Guinea, Papua, where there are carbon dioxide vents into the shallow underwater environment, is actually the fish which was supposed to smell the predator and run away or take the shelter under the acidified condition or under the high CO2 condition is going near to the predator. So this sort of instability will ultimately cause the functional or the ecosystem collapse in the marine environment. So this particular example, the main point of showing this particular example is that if the carbon dioxide can disrupt the sense to sense the predator in any species, it is also disrupting the sense to find the mate. It is also disrupting the sense to detect what is good, what is not good, what is friend, who is friend, who is not friend, and all sort of things, ultimately affecting the ecosystem functioning. Now, what question we can ask is, what marine organism would do to tackle climate change effects? In this picture, in this slide, you can see a whole lot of planktons or invertebrates, a whole lot of phytoplanktons or microscopic primary producers, sea grasses, seaweeds, corals, and other benthic community, as well as fishes, right? So there is no one particular mechanism to tackle the climate change effect. Depending on the organism, it can choose to acclimate it, or it cannot choose. I mean, it can either acclimatize, it can either adapt, or run away to the safer environment. So basically, one of three will happen to most of the species, depending on which organism we are talking about. Let us see the acclimatization. So in acclimatization, what it means is that the organism will try to adapt, or not adapt, try to withstand for the short term any environmental changes. Since it's a reversible process, most of the time it happens within generation. Sometimes there are also transgenerational acclimatization, and the degree of acclimatization mostly depends on the plasticity of the organism. So in this graph, we will understand what plasticity is. In the A, you can see that there is a genotype 1 and genotype 2. Under the different environmental condition, or under the gradient of environmental condition, if the fitness is stable, then this particular genotype 1 will be selected and genotype 2 will be lost, right? In the second graph, you will see that genotype 1 is actually try to increase its fitness trait as changing the environment, while genotype 2 is not able to keep up with the same pace in the trait fitness. Genotype 1 will be selected over here, and genotype 2 will go in the slower run. So this tells us that what is the phenotypic plasticity. If the plasticity is high, the chances of acclimatization under any environmental condition will be high. If the fitness trait is not up to the mark, in the longer run, the organism will not be able to acclimatize. Also, one important thing to understand is that acclimatization brings or buys time for any organism to adapt into any particular condition. So that could be seen as a first step to the adaptation. We will see in adaptation what is the actual meaning of, how you can differentiate acclimatization and adaptation. However, first we will see that what are the different adaptive mechanisms of acclimatization. So we all know that if any organism is undergoing stress or is undergoing in an environment which is not its native environment, there would be antioxidant defense, there would be changes in the energy metabolism, there might be changes in the epigenetic inheritance. So all three together will be responsible for the transgenerational fitness of the marine environment. So basically acclimatization can happen through epigenetics, that is the DNA methylation upstream of the translational factor or translational regulatory sites, right? Or any or upstream to any transcription factors, right? There could be biochemical changes. It can be ionic or osmotic changes. It means that in order to maintain the intercellular ion transport mechanism, there would be a shift in the ionic composition. Ultimately, that could be led to the gene regulatory network, that is GRN of the organism. That is either inducing the heat shock protein or inducing the antioxidant mechanism and so on and so forth. So this all process combinedly can buy you a time for most, maybe adaptation can happen. So this process can be called as acclimatization, which is very important to understand. It's a reversible and it happens in a short term. Now we'll go to the adaptation. Mostly the big difference between acclimatization and adaptation is that adaptation is mostly any changes which is happening in the genetic material and having heritability. And once it is happening in a population, it improves the fitness, and the heritable traits will keep on going from generation to generation. Whereas in acclimatization, heritability is slightly low or none, as well as it happens in a short term process or in a short time, and it is mostly reversible, right? So adaptation in the marine environment to climate change or to let's say the ocean acidification or ocean warming, how it is happening, it is very difficult to study the adaptation because often it is considered as a long-term process which is happening at the geological time scale. There are instances for the rapid evolution in several marine species. There are two ways to study the adaptation potential of any marine organism. One is experimental evolution. Second one is to understand or to study the natural acidified vents, thermal gradients, pH gradients, which I will come in the next slide. First, we will look what experimental evolution is. Experimental evolution is a process where we are exposing any microorganism or any organism having a short generation time to multi-generation experiment, exposed to the condition which we want them to adapt. As for example, in this Nature Geoscience published paper, they, in a key phytoplankton species, that is Amelia axelia coccolithophore, calcified coccolithophore, which was seen to be adapted or evolved under the ocean acidification condition in a multi-generational experimental evolution experiment. In the second paper, again, you can see that once you grow any organism to 1000 or 2000 generation time, there are chances that there are traits which improves or which extends the fitness of the species or the organism, if that is heritable and if that promotes the fitness in the organism, will be called as adapted or evolved. However, what we need to understand that it is suitable for only those organisms which are having the short generation time. Once the organism which you are, if you are talking about long generation time or macroorganism like seaweeds or sea urchins or some other organism, then you will have to explore, or people have explored. There are ways where people have proven that there are evolutionary changes happening in the natural conditions in the short term time. There are several volcanic vents in the shallow seawater, mostly in the Mediterranean and in those areas where the tectonic plates are not very stable. So because of that, there are flux of carbon dioxide which is coming out from the sea surface and decreasing the pH of that particular water. Now, if that process is happening for a long time, and if there are organisms which is already living there for multiple generations, you can expect that the species are either acclimatized in the long term or adapted. Now, one of my work on Sargassum vulgare in the Ischia in Italy volcanic CO2 vent, we performed the de novo transcriptome analysis in order to find that what could be the probable response mechanism of Sargassum vulgare to adapt into the lowered pH conditions, right? And we found that there are genes in the population which are thriving in the acidified vents are slightly different, or you can say kind of fixed traits into the population, Sargassum population in the vent areas, in comparison to other nearby control areas. So we saw, again, I'd like to go back in this slide and show you that if any organism have what any organism can do to tackle, either acclimatize or adapt or run away to a safer environment, which is with the option is available. And we can see often news about the invasion of the species in the temperate reefs and toward the polar region. So what happened in that the species from the tropical areas would go into the temperate reef and stabilize themselves there. There are issues when we talk about the invasion. It may add a new species to that particular native environment, but it competes with for the nutrient space with the native environment. For example, in this figure, if you see that this collarpa, which went into the Mediterranean and competed with the habitat forming sargassum and other species, collarpa actually took over the reefs, temperate reef in the Mediterranean, and did not allow the canopy forming seaweed to grow. As a result of which, there is a destruction of the habitat, loss of some of the native species or native seaweeds associated invertebrates. Sometimes this invasive species also bring pathogens with them. So that is also possible that the invasive species itself is not can tolerate that particular microorganism, but once it goes into the new environment, that microorganism can act as a pathogen to the native species and cause the loss of the biodiversity, right? Another example where the invasive seaweed has transformed the habitat structure and increased the biodiversity of associated species. Again, why I put this slide in order to understand is that there are instances where we are saying that the invasive seaweeds are causing the biodiversity loss. In this case, there is an increase in the associated biodiversity because the species of this seaweed, which is invasive in this Canadian population, is hosting a lot of macroinvertebrates. But what is important to understand is that even though the species richness or the diversity is increased, the function of the species which is lost is disrupted. So we don't have to always see that the species richness is the biodiversity. Also, functional diversity in the native environment is very much important, right? So let us see that the climate change, mostly ocean acidification, ocean warming, deoxygenation, is causing a lot of loss in the habitat complexity, either through the coral bleaching, which is predominantly happening in the tropical countries, and very recently happened in Great Barrier Reef in Australia. Now, the loss of the habitat complexity mostly decreases the associated community diversity also. In this example, which is published from New Guinea Papua natural CO2 vents, this is a control environment where you can see a lot of coral with higher structural complexity. And in acidified vents where you have mostly the bolder corals with lesser structural complexity, here you can see that what I was talking about, that the carbon dioxide which is emitting from the sea floor in this particular picture, the study shows that the ratio of the species in the control condition was way higher than the species in the natural CO2 vents, mostly the calcified ones. So again, it means that the loss of habitat complexity is happening in the environment. Similarly, another example is from the Schia volcanic CO2 vent in Italy, where Christy Coker and Maria Cristina Gambi has actually kept some planks in the control and in the acidified area. In this image, you can see that in the control environment, the calcified organisms are also growing with the same pace than the non-calcified organisms. However, once it is going into the acidified condition, the calcifiers are not able to grow with the same pace that the non-calcifiers are growing. As a result of which, the seaweeds are dominating in the plank, right? Now, further increase the, further decrease the pH or further increase the acidification, and you will see that even the seaweeds with a canopy or let's say the fleshy seaweed is being replaced by turfs. So what it represents is that first, that the non-calcifiers will win the race against the calcifiers, and second, that there will be a simplification in the structural communities even within the non-calcifiers. That is, the fleshy will be replaced by the turf algae. As a result of which, we can see that there is a simplification of food web which is happening because of the ocean acidification. In this image, you can see that how the carbon dioxide has been emitted from the seafloor in Ischia. So to summarize what I have talked till now in last 45 minutes, let's say, most likely scenario in the tropical reef and most likely scenario in the temperate kelp forest, which was taken from a Chris Harley paper in 2012 in Journal of Phycology, is that in the current scenario, you will see that there are herbivorous, there are corals, there are calcified coralline algae, there are sea urchins, there are macroalgae. If we protect the future, then most probably we will still have some corals, some calcified coralline algae, and then you will have the macroalgae. If we don't protect the future and if we further exploit it, we will be left with herbivorous fishes and we will be left with macroalgae. Similarly, that is the story of the temperate reefs, tropical reefs. The story of the temperate kelp forest will be, if in the present scenario you have calcified herbivore, you have CCA, that is the coralline algae, you have turf algae, you have canopy forming kelps. In the future warming conditions, there are chances that the canopy forming kelps may not sustain that well. But in the future ocean acidification condition, the kelp may get advantage, turf algae can get advantage, but then calcified algae, sea urchin, and other calcified herbivores will be extinct or destroyed. Another important thing to understand is that, so in this slide we have seen that macroalgae are getting advantage, or let's say that the seagrass or any other primary producer which are dependent on, which are getting benefited because of the acidification are getting advantage. But that's not that simple. because we have to understand that even though that there is an increase in the productivity or increase in the biomass, there could be increase in the grazing because of the decreased nutritional value or decreased polyphenolic content of the macrophytes. Now, if the polyphenol is decreasing, which is a deterrent to the grazers, is decreasing, there is an increase in the grazing, which can ultimately affect the zooplankton, because the same amount of nutrient they will not get by eating equal volume of the producers in the zooplankton, affecting the reproductive performance, affecting the fitness of the invertebrates, small fishes and to large fishes. And we have seen that the microbes, which is increasing in the disease susceptibility, pathogen abundance, virulence, will again affect at different scales in the throughout the food chain. So what can we do about this? How we can control, or how we can actually mitigate and adapt to the climate change condition in the environment, in the marine environment? There are a number of instances where the coastal plant communities has been shown, or seaweed or macrophytes or everything together has shown to mitigate the climate change and provide the adaptation. In this figure, you can see that first that it will help in energy dissipation or the wave attenuation. It can trap the carbon into the sediment, right? It can stabilize the sediment. Similarly, the seagrasses is also helpful for that carbon burial, and there are opportunities for expansion because of the increased acidification. The mangroves are also fixing the carbon dioxide and putting into the sediment. More recently, the the seaweeds are also shown to mitigate the climate change by fixing the, or by sequester the carbon dioxide. Mostly by, once the seaweed, which is mostly in the coastal continental shelf, will go into the open sea, and slowly it goes and settle on the sea floor base, thus increasing the carbon sequestration potential. Now, mitigation can happen by carbon sequestration, by growing lots and lots of marine macrophytes to reduce the carbon dioxide footprints. It is having potential because mostly the seaweeds are having the bioenergy fossil fuel possibilities. It can reduce the methane emission if we feed the seaweed fed additives to ruminants. It can stimulate land-based production of livestock and in agriculture, whereas it can also at the same time adapt by increased storminess and the sea level rise, ocean acidification, and oxygen input to the coastal. This particular example in Sydney, they have restored the crayweed. It's a brown algae in the underwater, and has actually restored the whole ecosystem, marine ecosystem in the Australia. More recently, or more bleaching events and corals are dying. So one of the approach what the scientists have taken is to rebuild, to shield it, and to shade it, and to breed it. So breeding is mostly happening with the help of micropropagation or coral of opportunity. That is help in the rebuilding of the coral. And shading is another technique which the Australian researchers have been following by inducing the clouds in, above the sea to stop the sunlight. So the take-home message from last 1 hour of talk is that climate change is happening. That is real. We should not be in any doubt that climate change is not happening. Marine organisms are getting affected. Some are affected more, some are affected less, but more or less everything is affected. In the graph here, or in the picture here, you can see that the calcifying algae, corals, coccolithophores, mollusks, which are the cell dependent, are more affected. Non-calcifiers are little less affected, but more or less everything is affected. There is a loss of habitat complexity, which is leading to simplification in the food web. Since the nutritional values are decreasing into the at the primary producer level, it is affecting the food web. Various organisms stores the acclimatization, adaptation, and some are migrating to the colder water. Invasion are happening, but which is maintaining the seaweed, species diversity, but it is rooting out the native diversity, and it is actually affecting the functional diversity. Climate change is also bringing new diseases in the marine organism, and in the sea plants, mostly the macrophytes, seaweed, mangrove, and seagrass helps in the mitigation and adaptation. As a responsible citizen, what we should do is, see, very practically, we cannot in one go stop the global warming. We cannot stop the increase in temperature. It's whoever is saying it's kind of a myth that we can control it suddenly by using something. Only option is that if we reduce the carbon footprint. So everyone, I urge everyone to go and look into the carbon calculator, feed the values, and check whether you are producing more carbon than your city average, state average, national average, and the world average. And if so, then control it. There are several other important sites where you can get a lot of information about global warming, long-term monitoring of carbon dioxide, temperature, killing curve in the scripts, and this is the recent data that atmospheric carbon dioxide is having 416 ppm. And then you have a dedicated website called as co2science.org, where you have a lot of information about which species will be affected in what way. Thanks a lot. So this is the overall I would like to just